Hello, boys and girls, and welcome to another edition of Movie Goodness, where we examine life through cinema here on the KB Radio Network. I am your host, Kevin Reed, and today we're gonna have a debate. We're gonna have a fight, a heavyweight championship fight between two iconic 80s vampire films. When I think of 80s uh vampire films, there's two films that come to mind. Now, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. We know that this is the month of October, and this month I dedicated the month of October to Halloween. And we're gonna go over all scary movies in the month of October in honor of Halloween. You know, the first two episodes of this month were scary based. The first episode we went over the absolute classic from 50 years ago, The Exorcist. Just this past Friday's episode, since it was on Friday the 13th, we went over the Friday the 13th franchise. Now, on today's episode, I didn't want to just do a movie. You know, I didn't want to do one review or talk about one subject. So I decided it is one subject, to be fair. We're talking about vampires. And vampires are the most interesting monster in the monsterverse. You know, you have vampires, you have werewolves, you have Loch Ness monsters, you have Frankenstein monsters, you know, you have all of these different creatures of the night, so to speak, zombies and whatnot. But vampires, it's something about them. It's something sexy about them. It's something frightening about them. It's something. It has a bit of everything. And being as though I'm an '80s baby, and I love everything '80s, all the films that came out of that decade, I thought back on what vampire films from the '80s I can talk about, and two films popped in my head, and I was sitting there battling within myself which one I'm gonna talk about. Which one? You know, I rewatched both of them, and I said I can't just talk about one of them. I got to talk about both. But when we talk about both, I got to ask the question to all of you out there: which one is better? Is it the 1985 horror comedy Fright Night, or is it the 1987 once again horror comedy The Lost Boys? These are two of my all-time favorite vampire movies of all time. I love these films, and I thought it would be a fun debate to have today because both of them I love for individual reasons. You know that one does the other thing better than the other, but this one does this better than the other, and you know, and so on and so forth. And so this is going to be a fun episode because, as I stated, I rewatched both of these movies, and I have grown a greater appreciation for these films. You know, I had a good time once again watching these movies, and I still remember being scared in certain moments in these films. I didn't particularly get scared this go around when I watched them, but I do I do remember watching these for the first time back in the 80s and being scared in certain moments, and that memory just came back up, and I was like, oh yeah, this is why I love this movie. So today we're going to review both of these movies. Our first film we're going to review is the 1987 supernatural comedy horror film, The Lost Boys, and then we're going to review the 1985 comedy horror film, Fright Night. And after the reviews, we're going to break them down. We're going to compare the two and see which one is the best. Now, this is subjective. This is just a little fun little game that we're playing today because honestly, I love them both. I think both of these movies are great in their own right. But we can have fun with the debate on which one is better, and that's basically what we're gonna do today. So let's start off with our first review, and it is, of course, the 1987 American supernatural comedy horror film directed by the late great Joel Schumacher, The Lost Boys. And believe it or not, this film is an kind of an adaptation of Peter Pan. This is a direct reference, hence the name The Lost Boys, uh, for that franchise or for that property. You know, just think about it. Whereas we have Peter Pan and the Lost Boys who never grow old as long as they stay in Neverland. And in the Lost Boys, we have vampires who never grow old, and they're in Santa Cruz, California, which is the murder capital of the world. So you have that going for it. This film stars Jason Patrick, Kiefer Sutherland, Corey Haim, Corey Feldman, uh, Edward Herman, and Diane Weiss. I love the Lost Boys. Love the Lost Boys. It's not even a game. It's no part of this movie that I didn't like. I absolutely adore this film. The Lost Boys in this film, as I said, is a group of teenage vampires, and of course you have one lost girl in there as well. You know, they hang from the ceiling. You know, they don't sleep in coffins. They actually hang on the ceilings of their lair like giant bats. which is which is amazing. And at night they cruise the boardwalk in Santa Cruz, you know, which is, you know, the mass murder capital of the world, at least as it was depicted in the film. I did a little research, and this is actual facts. This facts that Santa Cruz, at least around that time, was pretty bad. But I digress. The movie stars Jason Patrick as Michael, a kid who moves to the town of Santa Cruz with his recently divorced mother, who is played by Diane Weiss, and his younger brother, Corey Haim. And this started the two Coreys going going through the 80s, you know, with Corey Haim and Corey Feldman. And this was the first time they were together on screen, and they paired up in many movies after that, you know, License to Drive and Dream a Little Dream and so on and so forth. It was a plethora of films they starred together, and they even starred in a reality show, I think in the early 2000s, The Two Coreys, for a little while before he passed away in 2010, I believe. And it was such a tragedy. His life story is so depressing. You know, it's so bad. What he went through as a young child star, which he wasn't the only one, but it really tore him up from the inside out. But this was their first pairing, and this was our first exposure to this dynamic duel in the 80s. And you saw early on the chemistry between the two of these young actors, and you can honestly see that they were friends, and they did become best friends while filming this movie. But let's break it down. Beginning with the actors, starting with Jason Patrick, who is the star of this film. Jason Patrick, who is the grandson of Jackie Gleason in real life. Can you believe that? Yes, the Honeymooners, Jackie Gleason. Yeah, that was his grandfather, and he plays the character of Michael here. And I must say, when I rewatched this a couple of days ago, I was just blown away because I don't remember the acting being good in these movies, in either one of these films. But I never really sat down and analyzed it like that until, you know, a couple of days ago. And I was like, man, there's some real good acting in these movies. And in particular, a couple of actors in this film, as well as Fright Night. But Jason Patrick is definitely a standout here. I've often wondered why Jason Patrick never got that big push. You know what I'm saying? The other young actors in that generation, with the Tom Cruises and the Brat Pack with Emilio Estevez and Charlie Sheens and around that age group. But he didn't get that same push. I don't know why. Because he's a phenomenal actor. If you watched him in anything else throughout his career, I'll direct you towards Narc. Uh, he had a nice role in this. It was a stupid movie, but I liked his role. I think The Losers was the name of it, and I liked him. He was the villain in that movie, and he also took over for Keanu Reeves in the sequel to Speed, which was a horrible movie, but it wasn't his fault. I actually liked his character, but we wanted Keanu Reeves back in that role. I mean, he didn't play the Keanu Reeves character, but it was. Anyways, we're not talking about that. We're talking about his performance in Lost Boys. I really enjoyed his performance. This tortured kid, and he was tortured after he made this stupid decision. And what I got out of it when I watched it recently was, which I didn't get when I was younger because I was younger and stupid, is that when you're young, you're stupid. You make these dumb decisions that will haunt you the rest of your life. Just simple decisions that will haunt you the rest of your life. And that's basically what happened to him. Wanting to follow the crowd, wanting to fit in with the crowd. And it just so happened the crowd he wanted to fit in with were vampires. And of course, he regrets it. And him trying to hide it from his mother and trying to still be a big brother to his little brother, and figuring out how to reverse this and whatnot. I thought it was a really, really good performance by Jason Patrick. Speaking of the vampires that he was rocking with, Kiefer Sutherland, man. This is pre 24 Kiefer Sutherland. This is pre Flatliners Kiefer Sutherland, which once again was directed by Joel Schumacher a few years after this. But I loved him in this role. He plays David, the leader of this biker gang of the Lost Boys, if you will. These vampires who stalk their prey in Santa Clara or Cruz. I thought that his performance was so menacing, and this was like my first time seeing Kiefer Sutherland in anything, and I became a huge fan on account of this film. He really spooked me out, man, with that voice, the Kiefer Sutherland voice, and with that makeup. It was just it was something different because it wasn't your typical I'm a vampire thing. It was such confidence, such swag that he had. He was just ultra cool in this role, and he played it so cool. I loved him as David. I loved him in this role. Going to the two Corys. The two Corys were awesome here. Corey Feldman and Corey Haim. I thought that their chemistry was undeniable. They supplied all the comedy in this film, and it was the 80s. The 80s had comedy and everything, so they couldn't just make a straight horror film, a pure vampire film with these vampires stalking these teenagers, being as though the vampires were teenagers themselves. But there was no joking with them. But as far as the two Corys, they really held down the comedy aspect of it, along with the other actor who played Corey Feldman's brother here. I think Jameson Newlander. He plays the other Frog brothers. Their names were Frog, but their first names were Edgar and Allan Frog. Edgar and Allan Poe. Yeah, that was Nice little nugget. But yeah, anywho's, I loved their chemistry. I loved how they, you know, kept it leveled, kept it kind of cool. As far as the comedy, to keep us grounded, that it didn't get too heavy throughout this film. Um, the other actors, they were fine. They weren't they weren't the greatest. They were 80s. That's about as much as I can say. They were 80s. And you felt the 80s in this movie. Uh this was just to give you a look ahead, this is the most 80s of these two films. And I you felt it with the rest of this cast, especially with uh the costume design and the set design and everything else, the music. Oh my god, the music. Um the music is definitely 80s. And I loved every minute of it. Moving on to special effects, this had some good special effects as well. It wasn't over reliant on it. It wasn't uh you know them turning into bats, or vanishing here, or popping up, teleporting over here. It was a nice inventive way that Joel Schumacher showed them flying. You never see them flying. He just used the camera from a point of view angle in the sky, swooping down and all this here. I thought that was nice. I thought that was really cool the way he did that. You didn't have to show them fly, and plus it's less expensive than putting actors on rigs and wires and stuff like that. So it made sense. But I really like that aspect of it. Um, the makeup effects. This had the best makeup effects. Even now, movies that come out now, it rivals those. When Kiefer Sutherland goes vamped out, and all the rest of them vamp out, and we finally see Michael at the end vamp out. Boy, those creature effects, those special makeup effects on them were amazing, because it wasn't over the top, horns coming out and just ridiculous looking facial structures. It was their facial structure, but it was just changed. It was more monstrative, and I like that, because at times when you see movies, especially in werewolf films, when you see the transformation sequence, and you're like, well, how did they revert back? Why their skin didn't tear off or something like that? It's just unbelievable, and you got to kind of suspend disbelief. Of course, it's a movie, but sometimes you want a little touch of realism. And this did it. They didn't change their face. It was just they were just ugly. They just made them ugly with long teeth and the eyes, and it was just, oh man, it was creepy back then, very creepy back then, and it might be now to some people, but I really loved the effects. I mentioned Joel Schumacher a few times. Joel Schumacher's legacy, a lot of people revert to his Batman films, Batman Forever and Batman and Robin, and I think unfairly judge him off of those two films. Joel Schumacher has an amazing filmography, amazing, and I guess that's why a lot of people are hurt, including me, by his Batman films, because there are nothing like the movies he's made in the past. God rest his soul. But I mean, simply amazing. Let me run down some of his filmography. Now, it started back in the 70s. He started off writing films. He wrote Sparkle, with Diana Ross. He wrote Car Wash. Yes, he wrote Car Wash. He wrote The Wiz. A lot of people don't know that. He got his directorial debut in The Incredible Shrinking Woman in 1981. He went on to direct DC Cab, which I love. That's one of the funniest movies ever, with Mr. T in it. And also St. Elmo's Fire, Flatliners, The Client, A Time to Kill. $8 millimeter, Bad Company, Phone Booth. I mean, the dude is an amazing film. Or should I say, was an amazing filmmaker. And Falling Down. Oh my God, with Michael Douglas. If you haven't seen Falling Down, you missed out. The dude has an amazing filmography. So I never understood those Batman movies that he made. But going back to the Lost Boys, once again, he is firing on all cylinders here, capturing this teenage vibe of the 80s, this rebellious attitude that was surrounding the teenagers of that era. And uh, showing it in a different way, using the vampire mythology as a way of showing teenage rebellion of the 80s, and I thought that was a unique and interesting way to show this film. Anywho's, this is one of my favorite movies of all time, let alone vampire films, but it's one of my favorite movies of all time. I've watched The Lost Boys at least once a year for for the better part of 30 years. I love The Lost Boys, and it's still one of the best vampire films out there. You can hold it up against any other film and it will hold its own. And that includes the film that we're about to review next. But this is a masterpiece, in my humble opinion. I love the climax of this film. I love the unique and different ways they use typical vampire tropes in film. This and they used it in a different way here, and I thought that they did an excellent job of doing that. Such a fun time. The Lost Boys, released in 1987, gets a letter grade of an A. I love this movie, and it deserves its cult status moniker that is over this film. Amazing film. Amazing film. This movie was made for $8.5 million. It grossed $31.2 million back in 87, making it a surefire hit. We did get 2 sequels from this from this franchise, which came out later. I mean, like early 2000s, that I never watched because they didn't have anything to do with well, they did technically, from what I heard, because somebody told me about them, but I was like, I don't want to see it. I did not want to see it. It was directed DVD films, Lost Boys The Tribe and Lost Boys The Thirst. And they also had 2 comic book series that came out from this as well. They are planning on doing a reboot of this franchise, which was announced back in 2021, I believe, and I haven't heard anything else about it. I know one of the kids from Stranger Things was going to be in it, and the young man from It, Mikey, I think. I think they were going to be in it because that was 2 years ago. I don't know. I don't know. I tried to look it up before the show. I have found nothing other than that announcement back in 2021. So I don't know if it's dead in the water or they're waiting for the strike to end. I don't know, but that was the word. But in my humble opinion, leave it alone. Don't remake this movie. It is perfect the way it is. There's really no way you can improve on it. I don't see what you could do to improve upon this film. But I mean, I've been shocked before. I've said, things that I thought they should just leave alone, went and saw the remake or the reboot or whatever. I was like, that was pretty good. So who knows, but we shall see. But we do have the 87 version, which we can enjoy forever. The Lost Boys gets an A. That leads us to our second and final film in this battle for vampire supremacy of the 80s. It is none other than the 1985 horror comedy directed by Tom Holland, No, not Spider-Man Tom Holland. Um, Fright Night. This film stars Chris Sarandon, William Ragsdale, Roddy McDowall, Amanda Barris, Stephen Jeffries, and Art Evans. The film follows young Charlie Brewster, who discovers that his next door neighbor, Jerry Dandridge, is a vampire. When no one believes him, Charlie decides to get Peter Vincent, a TV show host who acts in films as a vampire hunter, to stop Jerry's killing spree. This was another one that was like I watched this. I remember watching this late night one night on HBO, and I regretted it that I watched it. This, unlike The Lost Boys, this was actually a frightening movie. Even though Lost Boys had frights in it, it was scary. But this was a different one. This felt like a Dracula film updated to 1985. This felt like Dracula. And Chris Sarandon, who plays Jerry Dandridge in this film, is the best vampire I have seen on film ever. And I know that can be blasphemy for a lot of fans of Dracula films from the 60s, 70s, whenever, or recent films that feature Dracula. I don't know. But this version of a vampire, it was everything that I described earlier in the show. Sexy, frightening, charming, menacing, all the attributes that we know from all of these vampire films throughout history wrapped up in one. And Chris Sarandon was amazing in this role. I mean, amazing. Before I go any further, this film did get a remake, unlike The Lost Boys, which they announced a remake for. They haven't made it yet. This film actually did get a remake in 2011, I believe, and it starred Colin Farrell as Jerry Dandridge, and it was a different take. It was an all right movie. It was all right, but it wasn't nowhere near what the original is, and it bothers me to this day because I always it goes back to what I was saying. Some movies you should just leave alone, man. Don't touch it. Don't touch, and it they did it anyway. they did it anyway. But the point I was trying to make was that Colin Farrell, who is an amazing actor, who played the role of Jerry Dandridge, as good as he was, he couldn't hold a candle to Chris Sarandon. Couldn't hold a candle. And I know these were two different directions they went with the original and the remake, but I mean, it was night and day. Chris Sarandon, I've seen him in numerous films, Child's Play, the original Child's Play, which was directed by Tom Holland. Yet again, they paired up again for that, as well as The Princess Bride, Dog Day Afternoon with Al Pacino. He was in The Nightmare Before Christmas, or should I say provided the voice in The Nightmare Before Christmas. The dude has an awesome filmography throughout all of these years. He's still working to this day. And I think this is one of his best performances throughout his long filmography. And nothing can touch it. Nothing. Especially when it comes to vampire films. Best portrayal of a vampire I have ever seen. William Ragsdale as Charlie Brewster, he was decent. He was your typical teenager that you could think of around that era. He felt kind of old to play that part. Even I felt that in 1985. I felt like he was too old for this. Like, he don't look like a teenager, even though he could have been. I don't know. People look older to me back then because I was I was 5 or 6 years old when I saw it, so whatever. But yeah, I just felt he kind of looked old. Amanda Barris, who went on to be on Married with Children, she plays the damsel in distress here of Amy, and boy, this was this was uh this was a role. She was just this cute little girl next door, and then when she's bitten later on in the film, that scene when she got bit, I think that was my first time that I was kind of like, ooh, you know. I ain't gonna get into details, but it was like, oh man, this is a sexy thing. The way it was like a sexual encounter, but she was getting the blood sucked out of her neck. You know what I'm saying? But the way it was filmed, it just got there, and I don't know. I don't know if they did that on purpose or I just have a messed up head. But either way it went, or it could have been a perfect marriage or both. But either way, it was weird. And then when she uh changed into this vampire and ripped off her lips, and she just had teeth. It was crazy. It was crazy. Um, Stephen Jeffries as Evil Ed. I love this dude. I really do. I love that character. He has that Weasley little voice. And he's just the perfect actor to play this role, and you feel so bad for him when Jerry Dandridge chases him down that alley and corners him and ultimately kills him, I guess you could say, or bites him, turns him into a vampire. That was so heartbreaking. The way he broke down, just take my hand, because you're getting bullied and you're doing, people talk about you and this, that, and the third. Once again, touching in on the teenage phobias, no matter what the era is, the teenagers go through it now, being bullied and all this here. That's why I always say this is nothing new. How people act like it's new that teenagers get bullied. They just find different ways now, they do it online now and stuff like that. But teenagers always got bullied, no matter whatever it was. We all went through it. Either we got bullied or we were the bullies themselves. But anywho's, it was just so heartbreaking, and he was crying like, oh, I should just take his hand, and he took his hand and he turned him into a vampire, and you're like, no, man, no, don't do it. And you hear him screaming down the alley. It was heartbreaking. That was it was just one of those things that sticks in my brain forever. I would never forget that. But the star of this film, who isn't the technically the star, but stole the movie, Roddy McDowall as Peter Vincent, the vampire killer. Oh man, I loved his portrayal here. Little history note here. Roddy McDowall's performance here is what inspired Johnny Depp's performance in the pirate films. He based Jack Sparrow on Roddy McDowall's portrayal in this movie. And so there you have it. We wouldn't have Jack Sparrow if it wasn't for this film. But yes, this performance was so good. So good for him being this washed up actor, being hunted down by this naive kid. He thinks he's just a fan and wants an autograph and whatever. And it turns out, oh, I need your help to kill a vampire that lives next door. And it's for him to be like, are you serious, dude? You know what I'm saying? It was a weird performance, but a great performance by Roddy, who went from a non-believer to a true believer, literally. Depicted later on when they're fighting Jerry Dandridge, and he brings out the cross in front of him and tells him to step back and all this here, and Jerry laughs at him like, that doesn't work. You have to have faith. You have have to have faith for that to work. It didn't work, but when Charlie uses it, it works because he has faith. But Vincent didn't. And so when it came back around again to try to use the cross, and it still didn't work. And once again, Jerry laughs at him. And Roddy McDowell does this little thing, this performance that once again stays in my head forever. The moment he just, I guess you could say, let go and let God. And he just took a deep breath and he opened his eyes with a smirk on his face and held that cross even stronger, even tighter. And all of a sudden, Jerry starts to, he starts to feel it because Vincent regained his faith. And it started to tear Jerry apart, with that cross. And I thought that was amazing to depict that little thing in this film, because I'm a Christian. So a lot of that stuff warms my heart, even though this is a vampire film. But whatever. I think this movie took itself very serious, unlike the Lost Boys, which you could say took itself serious at parts, but it knew what it was. This film knew what it was as well, but it is definitely the most serious out of the two. This is a very brutal film and less 90s. If you 90s, less 80s, if you want to get technical. This stands out as a film you can watch in any era and believe that it was in a certain area. Now, in certain scenes, is 80s, with the music or the style of clothes or whatever. In certain scenes, unlike the Lost Boys, throughout that from opening shot to the final shot of that film, you knew it was 80s. This one. Not so much. It was set out of time, if you will. But the direction here was great, very creepy, very frightening. One of the most frightening scenes is the scene when Jerry enters Charlie's home one night, and terrorizes him in the home, and barricades the mom in the bedroom and comes after Charlie and he's about to kill him, and it was brutal. But that was one of the most frightening scenes in this film because it's like you're next door. It is one of the most terrifying concepts I have ever heard, man. I mean, you living next door to a vampire. But this film is definitely, once again, just like Lost Boys, one of my favorites. It is an absolute classic. Fright Night from 1985 gets a letter grade of an A. There's not a flaw in this movie either. This was such an exciting time to watch these type of films, man. I'm telling you, the 80s hit different. I don't know how to explain it, man. This was so good. And this film features probably one of the best vampire kills of all time. The final showdown with Charlie and Peter and Jerry. One of the best ways I've seen a vampire murdered ever. I thought it was just lights out excitement, man. I mean, I was pumped up when that happened. The first time I watched it, this is pre you can rewind live television. I wanted to rewind it so bad, you know what I'm saying? I wanted to see it again the way they vanquished Jerry with the sunlight. That was awesome. But anywho, yes, it gets an A. And so now, with both of these films getting A's, you have to ask yourself, well, which one is better? They got the same grade. How do you break down both of these movies and come up with a definitive winner? Well, I don't know if it's going to be definitive or not, but I did pose some questions. And so with these questions, I'm gonna see who fares out better in this matchup. Let's start with the characters. Both of these flicks have some of the most memorable characters in film history, but which film has the more memorable characters? Let's start with Fright Night. With Fright Night, it stars Chris Sarandon, Ronnie McDowell, Amanda Barris, and William Ragsdale. To kind of be honest about it all, they really don't have that many characters to carry the story along. William Ragsdale, he plays a young vampire slayer, and his girlfriend, who was played by Amanda Barris, they're fine in the film, but the only really interesting characters are Ronnie McDowell's character of Peter Vincent, and of course Chris Sarandon as Jerry Dandridge. And so their interaction is definitely the highlight of the movie, but otherwise, there's not much else to say about the characters in Fright Night. Moving over to the Lost Boys characters, the Lost Boys is interesting since the vampires are kind of the main attraction of the film. You of course have not Chris, but Kiefer Sutherland as David, as well as a few other vampires. One of them is Alex Winter, who is either Bill or Ted. I can't remember which one which one he is. Him and Keanu Reeves. But anywho's, you have the two Corys in it. You have the sexy saxophone player. The roided up saxophone player. Still believe. You have that in there. It was just fun. So which movie characters were better? It's the Lost Boys. The Lost Boys have the better characters. I love Roddy McDowell. I love Chris Sarandon. But man, I have to give it to the Lost Boys. They had the two Corys in it. That alone, that alone gets them to win, in my opinion. So let's go to the plot. Which of these films had the better plot? Let's start with Fright Night. Fright Night's story is pretty simple. I mean, it's pretty simple, but it is effective. A teenager who loves horror movies noticed that a vampire moves next door. So he enlists the help of an actor who actually plays a vampire hunter on screen to kill him. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple, all fun. Let's move over to the Lost Boys plot. Okay, so it's not like the Lost Boys plot is confusing, but it seems a little scattered. You have Michael who becomes a vampire one night but doesn't want to be one any longer. You have his younger brother Sam, who tries to help him, but then we also have the Frog Brothers, who are vampire hunters themselves. Then we have the side story of a child and a woman who also no longer want to be vampires. It's just a lot. It's a lot going on. But at the end of the day, it was good. It was great to see on screen, but I think it was a lot to follow. Whereas Fright Night, you was on one narrow path throughout, and it was just a straight shot to the end. Which movie had the better plot? Fright Night. Fright Night was just straightforward and funny. It had its funny moments as well, which is exactly what you want in a horror comedy. So Fright Night gets the edge as far as the plot. Scary. Which one was the scariest? Now, scariness, of course, is purely subjective. The scary factor is really subjective. That's really debatable. That's just something that, is a horror film. So we gotta go over it. Which one is scarier? So let's start with Fright Night. Fright Night is a comedy at heart. It's a comedy at heart, but it's also kind of scary. It is very scary. It really at at the end of the day, like I mentioned a little while ago, has the worst scenario you could think of in human history, living next door to a vampire. That is scary, man. That is frightening. Whereas the Lost Boys, it's funny. It's, I would say it's more of a comedy. Just like Fright Night has this comedy too, but this felt like it had more comedy in it. Even though Kiefer Sutherland's portrayal as David was very scary, very intimidating, and there's a scene where the vampires reveal themselves and they kill a bunch of people around this campfire, whatever they were doing. That was brutal. It was brutal. But aside from that, it really didn't have too many scares in The Lost Boys. So which movie has the better scares? I'll have to give it to Fright Night. Fright Night, it was pretty funny, but the female vampire, that's still to this day, when Amanda Barris transformed and her mouth was blah, 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 still to this day give me the EBGBs. And so yeah, I had to give the edge there to Fright Night. The resilience of these two films, their legacy, how they hold up today. Beginning with Fright Night. Fright Night has always been sort of a cult classic, even back when it debuted in the 80s. But there are a certain community of horror fans who know about it and love it, but it's never really got that mainstream love. You know what I'm saying? It's never been in the upper echelons of horror films where people discuss them. It's the kind of flick you compare to something like The Lost Boys. You rarely find the Lost Boys fans comparing The Lost Boys to Fright Night, but they'll compare Fright Night to The Lost, if that makes it. It's, but you get what I'm saying here. It's not really up there as a staple in vampire movies or horror movies or whatever. But The Lost Boys, it is still talked about to this day. To this day. And if you poll 10 people, 8 to 9 of them know about The Lost Boys. That one was born 10 years ago. Everybody knows about The Lost Boys. I mean, a scene from The Lost Boys. Everybody knows about the muscle bound man playing the saxophone at that concert. There are memes of this still. I mean, they have memes of this movie. So, I mean, you tell me. It still holds up. So which one is the most resilient? It's The Lost Boys. The Lost Boys gets that category. Who has the best vampires? Now, let's start with Fright Night. There really aren't a lot of vampires in Fright Night. There's Jerry Dandridge and Evil Ed and Amy. Those are pretty much it. The ones he transformed into vampires. But there aren't too many vampires in here. Now, the vampires that are in here are awesome in their own individual way. Evil Ed turning into a wolf and going after Peter Vincent in Charlie Brewster's house. That was pretty fire. And I done said countless times how freaked out I was about Amy when she turned into a vampire. And the fact that Jerry Dandridge turns into a bat later on, that was pretty gangster. So they were cool, but there weren't a lot of them. Whereas the Lost Boys, there are plethora of vampires in that movie. And, there is the mystery of just who is the head vampire that plays out throughout the film. And we find out later on who it is, and actually finds a way to give you some gotcha moments. It was just a whole bunch of vampires in that movie. Everywhere you turn, there was a vampire. I do like that they sleep in sort of a bat cave in that film. That was a cool, inventive way to show these vampires. So I did like that. But which film has the best vampire? I'm gonna have to give it to Fright Night. It's crazy because Fright Night has far less vampires, and don't get me wrong, Keith Sutherland was amazing in this role as David, but everybody else was generic vampire number 1, 2, and 3. It just they were the same. Whereas in Fright Night, even though we had less vampires, each one had a different attribute. You know, it brought something different to the table, something more frightening to the table, no pun intended. And I think it just edges it out. You know, it edges it out. And as I said before, Chris Sarandon as this, I guess you could say Dracula ripoff, was perfectly cast in this role. And so I gotta give it to Fright Night. So that leads us to our final question. Which is the better film? I know a lot of you gonna disagree who are fans of these films. I get it. Like I said, it's subjective. But I want to say this before I go into the answer. I love both of these movies. Just because I say one is better than the other doesn't mean the other sucks. No pun intended. And so I just want to make that clear. But this is what I came up with. You know, The Lost Boys is far and away the most popular film out of the two. But when it comes to which one hits harder, Fright Night. Fright Night is the winner of the best out of these two films. I just can't. You know, I love that movie so much, and how it was just scarier. I think it all came down to truly being scarier and more rooted in I'm not going to say reality because we're talking about vampires here, but you know, the possibility, you know, if vampires existed, you know, living next door to one, you know, they would be just like, at least trying to be like everybody else. If they were real, you know, they would try to blend in with humanity, you know, and I guess you could say suck their way to the top. So for that reason, I got to give the edge to Fright Night, the best vampire film of the 80s. But I want to know, what do you think? Do you agree? Do you think Fright Night is the better of the two, or do you think The Lost Boys is the better of the two? Or do you think what's another vampire film that came out? Near Dark. Near Dark came out in the 80s. That was a real good vampire film. I think Bill Paxton was in that movie, Lance Henderson or Heckerson, I can never say his name right. But anyway, he was in that movie. That was a pretty good one too. It was a different take on vampires, which was another movie that I was debating on, kind of throwing in the mix to throw it off. But in any event, I settled on these two. I would like to know, what is your opinion about Fright Night and The Lost Boys? Who wins the night? Email the show, kbradiopodcast@gmail.com. You can look me up on all social media platforms. Just look up the KB Radio Network. Don't forget, we are on YouTube, everybody. Subscribe to the KB Radio Network channel. Like this video as well. Also, don't forget about the 5 stars, the reviews, and sharing this show. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, wherever you are currently listening to movie goodness here on the KB Radio Network. Everybody, thank you for joining me for this debate of which film was better, Fright Night or The Lost Boys. Can't wait to speak to you on the next go around. Want you all to know that I love you. Continue to love everyone. And until we speak again, you all be blessed.